That was the time I realised I would never have my own biological child. So I've spent probably the last 20 years of my life working in the corporate sector, in the marketing communications world. I was a competitive yacht racer as well. So I've done a lot of international travel and a lot of different careers. But it was a very high stress, busy lifestyle. No inclination to be a mum at all. I was an auntie to 14 nieces and nephews, and up until being a mum, it was the role I was most proud of. I was a very hands-on auntie. I really enjoyed it. I was much closer in age to my nieces and nephews than typical aunties might be. So it was a lot of fun, but I also realised how much work goes into raising children. So when I was in my 20s, all I wanted to do was have a career and travel the world, which I did. It wasn't until my early 30s when I incidentally found out I was infertile. It was like an instant, well, now I want to have a baby. I was single when I found out, and I was in a situation where I thought, oh my gosh, I'll never be able to meet anyone again because I am infertile. And of course, when you're in your 30s, you're meeting other people who are in their 30s who want to have kids or don't want to have kids. So I didn't want to be with anyone who didn't want to have kids, but no one who wanted to have kids. I didn't feel like I could be with anyone either because I knew I probably couldn't. As you go through the IVF journey, what seems very confronting at each step, and you go, oh, I'll never do that. But when you get to that point, you're much more open to it. It is very much a journey. So it starts out with, and in my case, where I was like, oh, well, can I just try artificial insemination? Because, there's less hormones and it's a little less intimidating and all those things. So that's kind of where the journey started. I did choose to do hormone assist. I was really nervous about doing it because I've never tolerated hormones at all well. So I've never been able to take the pill or anything like that. But I did much better at it than I thought. The biggest barrier for me was because I needed a donor. There's very limited options in Victoria, particularly at the time, and they can also select not to donate to people who are single or gay or identify as a different gender. That in itself was really confronting, that people who are making donations can say that a single mum's not going to be as good, so they're not going to donate, and same with, I'm sure that's very confronting for people who identify as a different gender. That was really hard at the time. So I ended up looking at international options, but in Victoria, the legislation's really different. It really depends on what state you're in. I've ended up doing IVF right down the east coast of Australia, so both Queensland, New South Wales and Victoria. Ended up, I was with Monash IVF. They have a practice up in Brisbane, so they were able to, up on the Gold Coast, they were able to tell me that they, in the Gold Coast, can access the American sperm donor bank where we couldn't in Victoria. So I selected a donor. I found the international donors much higher quality. You get about 10 pages of quite detailed information. The particular donor I ended up choosing also had a photo of what he looked like as a baby. So in Australia, you get such limited information but it's still like choosing off a menu. Like you've gone out to dinner and gone, oh yeah, flick, I'll have that one. Thanks, I'll have what she's having. Good. Yeah, I'd do all my treatment down in Victoria, and then when I was due to have the transfer, I'd jump on a plane and fly up to the Gold Coast. Added a big extra level of stress. Work out, but you learn a lot through that process. And like I said at the beginning, I was like, I'll never do IVF. I have too many hormones. I won't cope with that. It will be awful. I'll just give this a go. And the times you get through that and none of it works out, I was never officially pregnant on those 3 times. I think one time I probably was early pregnant. My sense of smell just went crazy. My favourite smell of frying off onions started to make me dry reach, and I was like, oh God, I'm pregnant. But it must have been a very early, they call it a chemical miscarriage, so it was something I was never aware of. Just my feeling on it. I think the hardest thing is every time you don't have a successful outcome, you're getting older. And so it's that constant battle in your mind of, I'm running out of time. You invest, and I kept a journal and a diary through that entire process, through the entire 12 years of the IVF process. So a lot of that was not just journaling, it was imaging. I had pictures of what this baby might look like, because it was a mixed race baby. And so you become very like focused on, you know, my baby might look a bit like this. And so when it doesn't eventuate, that changes. Yeah, it's hard to get your head around a little bit. Definitely a grieving process, but it's a really, I think going back to what I started with, it can be an incredibly lonely, isolating experience because a lot of people don't know that you're going through IVF. You miss out on social engagements, like my friend's wedding was a big one, and that affects your relationships with friends because they don't necessarily understand why, you know, I couldn't come to your wedding because I had to jump on a plane and you know, do an AI, you know, artificial insemination up on the Gold Coast. Like even if you tell people, it's very hard for people to understand if they haven't been down that process. By this stage, I had a new partner. I'd moved to Sydney, so I got a new IVF provider up there. It was during the time where they were the first to bring in Medicare-funded IVF in Sydney. So obviously, at about $10,000 a pop each time, that was a very attractive option. So tried them, but again, they only let you do it 3 times. So the hardest thing about that process was they were obviously trying to stimulate my own egg production. I produced 2 really big, mature, healthy eggs. You could see them on the ultrasound, and they wouldn't take them out. They wouldn't do a collection because it was only 2. So statistically, they wouldn't have survived through to, you know, an embryo. That was incredibly hard, knowing that there was 2 in there, that I was about to have a period and lose them both. So that was probably the hardest time, actually. Yeah, my partner and I at the time, we got 2 roses and we took them down to the ocean and just watched them float away. That was the time I realized I would never have my own biological child. So my baby, my miracle boy, is a donor. Donor egg. Yeah, I had one more treatment after that, and the intention, a girlfriend of mine had been through this process, and her and her husband ended up using a donor egg from South Africa. So that was my intention, to go to South Africa and use a donor egg. And then COVID happened on that last treatment. I think I finished my last IVF treatment about a week before the international borders shut down. And so in my mind, that was the end of the journey, because there was no other options. There were no females in my life that are suitable, because they were all too old, and there's not many females in my family. So it's a very male-dominated family. So I went through the process of, oh, that's it, I'm not having kids. And that's obviously its own grieving process. The best thing I could say is always be brave and have the conversation. So what actually happened was COVID, international borders locked down. I was like, oh my gosh, this is the end of my journey. As part of that, I was living in Sydney, so we had all the lockdown rules, very similar to Melbourne, and we could only go 5 kilometers from the house. So I was working from home, and I'd do a lot of my meetings on the phone while I was walking around and around my 5 kilometer zone. Anyway, I was walking one day and I hear this little voice that goes, hello, hello. I looked around and couldn't see this little voice, and it's like, hello. And I look up, and there's this 4-year-old, as it turns out. His name was Riley, standing up on the balcony of this house, just pulling out. So I walk up to him, I'm like, hi, what's your name? He's like, Riley. I said, is there an adult at home? And he goes, mum's in the bathroom with the twins, and he has twin brothers. Anyway, at some point, mum rushes out, stranger danger, stranger danger. And she goes, I'm so sorry, I've got twins in the bath. And she goes, I was just checking on Riley. I said, no, it's okay. I'm glad there's an adult here. I said, go for it. Anyway, I ran into her a couple of days later, the same thing. He was yelling out, going, hello, hello. And I'm like, hi, Riley. And he remembered my name as Sarla Koala. So that's what he was yelling out across the street. And anyway, I got chatting to mum, and she'd had all 3 of those children via, the first child, Riley, was via a known donor, and then the twins ended up being through an anonymous donor. And she said, oh, there's these Facebook groups that have, people that are happy to donate eggs. And I said, no, I didn't. And so jumped on a few of those over the coming weeks. And by this stage, we're starting to integrate back into work. And I'd been working on this massive project across multiple departments of the business. We'd never actually met in person. And so one day we all happened to be in the office at the same time. We're like, let's go have a coffee. Anyway, one of the girls were like, no, I can't. Let's just have a drink after work. And we all said, we've got something on tonight, but we've got time for one drink. We hopped in the elevator and the lady said to me, they're like, why are you doing this job? You're too qualified for it. And I said, well, because I was doing IVF at the time. And I said I needed something that was low stress, just a short-term contract that I could fit in because I had to prioritize the IVF. And I said, then COVID happened and they extended my contract and here I am. And they said, and this girl, absolute pocket rocket of a woman, she said, oh, I've got a friend who's always wanted to donate an egg. Said no one ever. And I didn't really think she knew what she was saying. Like, people say the silliest things when you're going through IVF, they just don't think about what they're, what it actually means. And so I didn't really give it any thought. We had our one drink, we all went our separate ways. And that was on a Thursday night. The following Tuesday, she calls me on Teams and she goes, I spoke to my friend on the weekend. She really wants to meet you. And she gave me her details and hung up the phone and I burst into tears. It was such a shock and such a surprise. Like, in my head, that was the end of my journey. And it was just because I was brave enough to share my story with, women I'd never met in person in the lift on the way to one drink. And anyway, I was like, oh, how do I contact this woman? So, it was a few days later, I waited till Thursday again and had a couple of drinks because I needed a bit of Dutch courage. And I texted her and I said, I believe we both know Rachel. And I said, did you want to meet up and have a coffee? And so, yeah, we met up. She could have been my sister. She is vegetarian. She was tall. She had blue eyes, dark hair, she was really into social welfare and a lot of the industries I've worked in. And we just spoke for hours. She's a British girl. She was lesbian and she's never donated before. She's never donated since. But we went through rather an extended process and she produced 18 eggs and 5 embryos, which is extraordinary. It's a high number. And, I miscarried. It was a chemical miscarriage the first time. The second time was miscarriage of twins at 10 weeks. That was hard. And then the third time I got pregnant and I knew 8 hours after transfer I was pregnant. I was high risk preeclampsia, high risk gestational diabetes, high risk everything for the entire pregnancy. Every time I walked away from an appointment, I did a little dance because I never got any of those things, but I still went down the planned C-section. It was on Easter Tuesday. Yeah, it was very straightforward. I remember the baby before me, the woman before me, as soon as they took out their baby, they screamed and I burst into tears. I was like, oh my God, I'm just about to have one of them. Anyway, mine came out and he didn't really cry. And I had that moment of panic where I'm like, is he okay? But as I put him on my face, he shoved his hand in my mouth because it probably felt like my womb. And it was instant love. I had always been worried that genetically, because he wasn't mine and because of the journey I'd been on and I'd been through a lot in that pregnancy, that it would be more of a gradual love. But no, with him, it was absolutely instant. He is such a happy, intelligent, wonderful little human that's really fun and adventurous to hang out with. And I made sure I enjoyed every stage, but I just feel like we've hit our groove now and it's really nice and it's everything and more. Give up hope and be open to different options. When someone first suggested to me to use a donor egg, I was like, no way, I want it to be mine. I don't love him any less, and the fact that he's biologically not mine isn't any different. So be open to different options and be brave and have the conversations, because if I hadn't have had that chance conversation, I wouldn't have my son.